Hello there, and welcome to my guide of sorts for this piece of diorama that Games Workshop did for Lord of the Rings. I made sure I left everything in a sub-assembly, that way I can spray it and paint it a lot easier, and the spray I used was matte black spray from Colourforge. I then painted every bit of tree, all the mud, and all the future greenery with some dryad bark. And all of this was then given a wash with some Agrax Earthshade just to deepen that colour a little bit. Once that wash dried, I then went ahead and dry brushed the miniature with some more dryad bark just to brighten things up ever so slightly, and of course avoiding all those recesses. This was then followed up by another dry brush, a slightly lighter dry brush of a 50-50 mix of dryad bark and Gothor brown. Then another dry brush, this time just Gothor brown by itself. And then for the final dry brush, it was a 50-50 mix of Gothor brown and Wraithbone. For the dirt, I used some Steel Legion drab. This was followed by a 50-50 mix of Steel Legion drab and Talon sand. I then painted the inside of the tree, the inner bark, with some Xandri dust. I picked out the little mushrooms with some Wraithbone. Any leaves were picked out with some Deathweld Forest. And then finally I picked out some of the rocks with some Dawnstone. All of these sections were then washed with some Army Painter Softtone. And while that dries, I'm going to use some Abaddon Black to fill in the areas that the spray might have missed on the Ringwraith. Once that had dried, I then dry brushed the Ringwraith with some Corvus Black. Then continued to dry brush him with some Eshin Grey. And then finally at the bottom of areas and sort of the peaks and tips, I dry brushed him with some Mechanica Standard Grey. For the horse, I painted that with some Catachan Flesh. And then painted any areas that were going to be silver with some Iron Hand Steel. Then all of the silver, the bridle on the horse, and the horse itself were given a wash with some Agrax Earthshade. When that wash dried, I went ahead and lightened the mushrooms once again using Wraithbone. And this was followed by a 50-50 mix of Wraithbone and matte white just for the very sort of tips and tops of the mushroom caps. Wasn't entirely happy with how dark the tree was, so I went ahead and lightened it ever so slightly with some Xandri dust. Now this is a very light dry brush, being very careful and making sure that I didn't press too hard because I don't want the tree to be too light. Unlike the inside, however, I did dry brush the Xandri dust on quite heavily. I then went ahead and dry brushed some more Deathweld Forest back onto the leaves, being very careful to make sure I didn't hit any of the wood. This is then followed by a 70-30 mix of Deathweld Forest and Wraithbone. Once again, I applied it by using a very, very light dry brush. I then repainted the rocks using Dawnstone, but avoiding any of the recesses and making sure that I kept some of the shading. And this was followed by a 50-50 mix of Dawnstone and Grey Seer. I then highlighted the horse's fur with a 70-30 mix of Catachan Flesh and Wraithbone. And I also used that exact same mix to dry brush the areas with any hair. I then added a little bit more Wraithbone to the mix, creating a sort of 50-50 mix, and just highlight everything once again, but very carefully, and again just on the peaks and tips. With the rider out of the way, I then went ahead and started painting the hobbits. I started with Frodo and painted his vest with Mournfang brown. His jacket I painted with Rhinox hide. I then painted his and Merry's trousers with some Dryad bark. Pippin's trousers and Sam's jacket were painted with some Skavenblight dinge. Merry's waistcoat with some Balor brown. And the little sack that Merry is carrying I painted with Xandri dust. All of these areas were then washed with some Army Painter soft tone. While that wash dried, I painted the carrot at the front with some Jacaro orange, which I highlighted with a 50-50 mix of Jacaro orange and matte white. The leaves on the carrot were then painted with Warpstone Glow, which was then highlighted with a 50-50 mix of Warpstone Glow and matte white. Once the wash had dried, I then did a 50-50 mix of Mornfang Brown and Scrag Brown to highlight Frodo's waistcoat. I then did a 50-50 mix of Dryad Bark and Gothel Brown to highlight Frodo's and Merry's trousers. This was followed by a second highlight of Gothel Brown. For Frodo's jacket, I used some Catachan Flesh, followed by a 50-50 mix of Catachan Flesh and matte white. I then used Storm Vermin Fur to highlight Pippin's trousers and Sam's jacket. For the bag that Merry is holding, I relayered that with some Xandri dust, avoiding the recesses. And then I painted his jacket with some Caliban green. For Sam's trousers, I used some War Flesh, and washed both these areas with some Athonian camo shade. For Pippin's jacket, I used some Cantor Blue, and washed that with some Draconoff Nightshade. While those washes dried, I used some very blurry grey cere to paint their shirts, and highlighted them with a 50-50 mix of grey cere and matte white. I then highlighted Merry's shirt with a 50-50 mix of Caliban green and matte white. Sam's trousers with a 50-50 mix of War Flesh and matte white. And Pippin's jacket with a 50-50 mix of Cantor Blue and, you guessed it, matte white. I then painted the cabbage in his hands with some Warpstone Glow. And then I highlighted this with, you won't believe it, a 50-50 mix of Warpstone Glow and matte white. I then used Steel Legion Drab to paint their straps and backpacks, which I then gave a wash with some Army Painter soft tone. While that wash dried, I used some Cadian Flesh Tone to start painting their skin, which I then washed with some Reichland Flesh Shade. Going back to the straps, I then highlighted those with a 50-50 mix of Steel Legion Drab and, indeed, matte white. And once the wash on the skin had dried, I then used some Cadian Flesh Tone just to brighten things up a bit, leaving the shading. This was followed by a 50-50 mix of Cadian Flesh Tone and Kislev Flesh. And then finally, Kislev Flesh just by itself. Moving on to Frodo's hair, I painted that with some Dryad Bark. Don't forget to do their feet as well. Pippin's hair was painted with some Mornfang Brown. And Sam's and Merry's were painted with some Morghast Bone. I then washed the Mornfang Brown and Morghast Bone with some Army Painter soft tone, and Agrex Earthshade for the Dryad Bark. Finally, all that's left to do is neaten up the black around the bases, so for that I just used some Abaddon Black. And with that, the diorama is finished. I have to say, I really enjoyed painting this little diorama. It didn't take too long either, and it, as I said, is a lot of fun to sort out. It's a very good diorama if you want to practice sort of dry brushing and things like that. I would recommend it, however, I'm not entirely sure if you can get it anymore. I think it was a made-to-order product. So if you can get hold of it, it might be on the stupidly pricey side thanks to the eBay scalpers. In total, it only took about 6 hours to paint, which is really shocking for something so big. And as I said, I had a lot of fun painting it. There's lots of lovely detail in there. I didn't paint the eyes on the hobbits because, let's be honest, they are really small, and I didn't want to sort of mess up the way it looked. If you followed this guide, thank you so much for watching. I really do hope it helped you. And think about giving me a subscribe for more videos like this. And I will see you on the next one. Thanks again, and goodbye for now.